Welcome to Grade 7 History, Unit Number 1, New France and British North America, 1713 to 1800. This is Lesson Number 1, Who Wanted the Land and Why? Welcome to Grade 7 History. Before we begin today's first lesson, let's take some time to think back on things that we learned about Canada's history in Grade 6. So put the video on pause right now so that you can jot down 2 or 3 things that you remember learning about Canada's history last year, and then we'll discuss this at the start of our next class. In 1713, there was no such thing as Canada. Early French explorers, such as Jacques Cartier, heard native peoples use the word Kanata, which means village or settlement. The French thought that the name of the land was Canada, but they decided to name the area that they claimed to be New France. The map on page 22 in your textbook shows what New France looked like in 1713. You will notice that New France was made of what is now Quebec, as well as a large chunk of what is now the United States. Some of the land shown on the map was disputed territory. This was land that the French and the English were still competing for. So just take a look at this map here. Of course, we can see that the French had claimed a large portion of North America, and the British had also acquired a nice strip of land along the east coast of North America. But take a look at this map, look at the legend, and you'll see that there was one other country that was also making serious claims to land in North America and providing very strong competition for both the French and the English. As you learned in grade 6, Europeans had been coming to North America since the 1500s. They were competing to see who could claim the most land. Land in North America was to be used to collect natural resources, which could be turned into goods that could be sold in Europe. Europeans also wanted to create settlements in North America. These settlements would provide homes for Europeans who wanted to have a fresh start in life. The settlers would find work in the colonies, lands in North America that belonged to European countries, and they would collect the resources that their home countries were in search of. So, what resources were Europeans searching for? Well, there were several natural resources that were in short supply in Europe. For centuries, Europeans had been taking fish, fur, and timber from the land without thinking about the danger of using up these resources. By the 1500s, certain fish and fur-bearing animals were nearly extinct. When explorers came home with stories of huge quantities of fish, fur, and timber in North America, European kings and queens were quick to order full-scale exploration and settlement in North America. And lots of paintings from this time period. Here's just one painting showing many Europeans all taking whatever possessions they could with them, loading onto boats, which would take them to the New World, i.e. North America. The First Nations were very important to the explorers and the settlers. The First Nations taught the Europeans how to build canoes and sleds and how to travel through the harsh terrain. They began trading furs and fish with the Europeans in exchange for metal pots, tools, and cloth. Native women provided warm clothing and helped the Europeans prepare the transport of natural resources to Europe. The fur trade became a major part of the relationship between the Europeans and the First Nations. Since New France was so cold, the explorers and settlers needed fur clothes in order to stay warm. But in Europe, hats, and other items made from beaver pelts became a major fashion trend for the wealthy. The Europeans were eager to trade with the First Nations, who did not understand why the newcomers were so interested in trading valuable metals for something as common as fur. Just take a look at this diagram. These beaver hats were a sign of wealthy people's different roles in society in the 1600s and the 1700s. All of these hats, all made from beaver pelts. Looking back at grade 6 history, you learn that the First Nations have been living in North America for thousands of years. We use the term First Nations because there are many different native cultures, each having their own language, system of government, and traditions. All First Nations viewed the land and all life on Earth as sacred, and they all believed that the land belonged to everyone. Draw your attention to the diagram here on the left. The First Nations believed in the sacred circle, the idea that all forms of life are equally important and must be protected for the survival of the Earth. Sounds sort of like what we studied in geography class last year, doesn't it? A map on page 25 in your textbook shows where several First Nations were living in North America during the period 1650 to 1760. Settlements were built close to bodies of water to allow for a source of drinking water and transportation. The Iroquois Confederacy was made of 6 First Nations who spoke a common language. The Wendat, or Huron as they were called by the French, shared the land with the Iroquois. The Iroquois and Wendat farmed large enough crops that they could live in groups of over 1,000 people for 20 years before needing to relocate to an area that provided fresh farmland. The Algonquin, which consisted of several First Nations, lived in smaller groups, approximately 50 people per group. They fished and hunted for their food. In the 1600s, the French and the English tried to strengthen their claims to land in North America by increasing the size of their settlements. They built their settlements on land which the First Nations lived on. The French and the English felt that it was okay to do this because to them the First Nations were uncivilized savages. This is an early and very sad example of racism. In many ways, the First Nations were more advanced and more civilized than the Europeans. Unfortunately, it has only been within the last 50 years that people in North America have started to appreciate the history and the contributions made by native peoples. Look at this recent picture on the left. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has already been making a commitment to improving relations between Canada and its First Nations and trying to make amends for past injustices caused by the Canadian government. The first English settlement was built in Newfoundland. The English would focus their settlements along the east coast of North America to the south of the French settlements. The English would set up trading posts around James Bay, which made them closer to the First Nations and thereby making fur trading easier. And this is a famous image which shows the first meeting between John Guy and the Beothuk people around 1612. The French focused their settlements along the St. Lawrence River. The St. Lawrence was a perfect shipping route for fur trading. In the early 1600s, France started the seigneurial system. Under this system, the King of France gave pieces of land in New France to wealthy men who were known as seigneurs. The seigneurs rented their farmland to farmers for a small fee. The farmland, which was called seigneuries, were thin, flat strips of land that were close to water. Today, when traveling through or near Quebec, you can still see the patterns that were formed by dividing the land into thin strips. So I started out with this basic plan here. take the best land that was close to the river, cut it up into thin strips of land, and then rent out that farmland to peasant farmers who would, of course, build homes, farms, develop the land, and this pattern uh, was so firmly entrenched that even today on overhead maps, you can actually see that rectangular pattern going on. You don't even have to have an overhead shot, just depending on which part of Quebec you're traveling through, you can actually see the land still divided into these thin rectangular strips. All right, so let's conclude today's lesson by discussing the following. When I'm finished reading these 4 questions, you're going to put the video on pause. How do you feel First Nations peoples felt when they saw European explorers and settlers for the first time? Number 2, describe the connection between a woman wearing fur clothes in France and the fur trade in New France. 3, how do you think trading for metal goods changed life for the First Nations? And 4, what reasons do you think the Europeans had for feeling they were superior to the First Nations? Before you put this on pause, I do want you to write down your answers to these 4 questions because we will discuss our ideas, our responses to these at the start of our next class. Now, if you don't feel confident in answering these questions right now, it means you need to go back and watch this video at least 2 more times, and then when you're ready, get a pen or pencil, piece of paper ready to write down your responses to these questions. So put the video on pause now. And I look forward to hearing everybody's responses to these discussion questions in our next class. But until then, this concludes today's video.